You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Ennio Piano of George Mason University. Ennio, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So our topic for today is biker gangs. Ennio has written a few papers about the organization and the economics of biker gangs like the Hells Angels, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting conversation. So, Ennio, to start, how about you go through some of the early history of biker gangs? When did they emerge? Where did they come from?
Sure. So we actually know very little about the earliest days of these organizations. We kind of looked at the story goes that groups like that started emerging after World War I. And so you have these small groups of motorcycle aficionados in the United States between World War I and World War II. But then really the explosion of these groups happens after World War II, and especially among veterans of World War II. And some of the people who have written about these argue that it's mostly because Americans didn't really use motorcycles in the States before World War II. But the U.S. Army adopted motorcycles, especially in the Pacific. And so these veterans had been exposed to motorcycles, and so they enjoyed the experience in a way. And so they started all of these groups. And the very first groups were very different from what we see today. They were kind of like groups of young people that were mostly not allowed to join official groups of the American Motorcycle Association. And so they created their own clubs, and no one really was had any interest in them until in 1947 in Hollister, California. A group of outlaw bikers went to the American Motorcycle Association annual run. It's basically a big conference for motorcyclists, and it was the first one of its type. And they started a big fight, and they were responsible for the destruction of property, and they attracted the attention of journalists who were following the event. And I think the magazine Life wrote a big piece with pictures about them. And so the myth of the outlaw bikers started that way. And in fact, the very name, these groups are called outlaw motorcycle clubs, outlaw motorcycle gangs, or 1% motorcycle clubs. And the 1% comes from a phrase that was used by the president of the American Motorcycle Association to say, look, 99% of all motorcyclists in the United States are well-behaved citizens. It's only 1% that is, again, outlaws, a group of outlaws, and they're disrespectful of the law, and they destroy property, and they don't follow the rules. And the outlaw bikers actually officially endorsed these characterization. And for years, they wore on their jackets the symbol of 1%. And to be a 1% motorcycle club member, you needed to be a member of one of the top clubs in the genre. So that's kind of the origin of these organizations.
So that's interesting. There's the American Motorcycle Association, and it was just people who like motorcycles. I think growing up as a kid, it was confusing to me that biker gang was something criminal and not just a group of motorcycle enthusiasts, no more harmful than a group of model train enthusiasts or any other group of enthusiasts. But
correct.
It's interesting, why motorcycles? Is it just the case that any community can have a subset of it turn to crime, or is there something in particular about the motorcycle, the fact that it's loud and dangerous, at least more dangerous than other modes of transportation? Something about that makes it particularly prone to criminal organizations?
That's a great question. But let me explain a little bit the nature of these organizations in the first, let's say, 3 decades of their history, because it's not clear to me or to the people who study these organizations that they actually started as criminal groups. And it's interesting. The question about the motorcycles is also interesting. I have a theory about this in one of my papers, and which doesn't really explain why motorcycles, but it explains why the motorcycles that they chose were, as you said, the loud ones, the big ones, the ones that have a very peculiar look. And I think that there is an economic logic to that. But okay, so according to the history of these organizations, as I said, the first members were veterans. And they were not just veterans, they were veterans with a very specific social, ethnic, and cultural background. So they were mostly white males, and there were people from a lower middle class background, social background, and they were part of the sociologists who work on this literature called the saloon milieu, which is to say the social environment for lower middle class white people in areas like the Midwest or the Southeast or the West Coast. So blue collar families. If you look at the biography of a lot of the important figures in this movement, they grew up in households where they experienced a lot of violence. Their parents were divorced, their fathers that had alcohol problems, and so on and so forth. So clearly these are people that have a complicated history, personal history, and they have behavioral issues. And in fact, that's the reason why a lot of them were not allowed to join the AMA official clubs, because the people who did join were expelled because of their behavior. So the first clubs were established by people who were expelled from these groups and founded their own. And some people argue that one big theory about these groups is that they had a common preference for a sort of militaristic lifestyle. And the emphasis within these organizations is very much on brotherhood and supporting your fellow club members, and authority and violence are very important components of their lifestyle, as is what they call, their bravado. So exposing themselves to very dangerous situations, fighting in clubs and pubs. So this is kind of the theory of why these people created these clubs. And the motorcycle, the argument was just that they liked motorcycles. Now, I don't particularly enjoy this explanation because it's very much, it cannot be tested. We don't really know. We can really look back and look into the psychology of these people and what their preferences were with respect to motorcycle. So I'm a little skeptical of this. But even assuming that that's why motorcycles were involved since the beginning, there are some peculiar features of this organization that make me think that the motorcycle is just kind of a shelling point that these groups coordinated around this tool that serves a functional purpose in the making basically these groups work effectively. So in one of my papers, I used the theory on the economics of religious sects, especially the work of Larry Iannacone at Chapman University. He has this paper in which he argues that the success of religious sects in the United States basically since the 1950s and 1960s is due to the fact that they have very costly practices that basically screen in only people who are willing and likely to contribute to the production of the club good, that is the religious club good. And at the same time, these practices increase the opportunity cost of interacting with people from outside the group for the members, so that the members are kind of incentivized to keep entertaining relationships with the members of the group. And so they're kind of forced to keep producing more and more these club good. And it refers to these sacrifice and stigma. And basically the sacrifice, for example, would be to join, say, Eli Berman at UC San Diego has an interesting paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics on ultra-Orthodox Jewish groups in Israel. Well, if you want to be part of a group like that, you need to keep kosher. And that's a cost for some people. And that screens out people who are not really committed who don't really value being members of the group as much. But at the same time, keeping kosher also increases your cost of interacting with people from outside the group because, for example, you cannot go out for dinner with people who are not keeping kosher or go to have dinner at their place because they're not keeping kosher. And so you would be violating the rules of your own organization. And so the way that you dress sends a signal to people from outside the organization telling you, okay, that's a member of the organization. So it's a stigma. And that's why a lot of these sects and religious groups enforce a very strict, dress code. And so motorcycle gangs do exactly, or at least in the first 30 years of their history, did something very, very similar. And let me explain. So I argue that motorcycle gangs use both a sacrifice and a stigma to select members and to incentivize members to contribute to the good that they were providing, the club good that they were providing. And we can talk about the nature of this good that was supplied. It's actually very complicated to really point to a specific good. And the people working in the economics of religion have the same problem. Yanaconi himself doesn't really have a specific good in mind. He kind of has a list, but it's unclear whether we really know what the good being provided. It's not like a club that provides you access to a pool or to a golf club, right? It's a slightly different situation. So go ahead.
So we should probably go through the theory of the club good and exactly how that works. So,
sure.
As you've said, by creating barriers, by making it costly to enter the club, you make the club good more valuable. You increase its appeal. And specifically with biker gangs, they have all these cultural practices, that are not unlike a religion in that they impose these costs to be part of the group, and they have hazing rituals and things like that. How do economists recognize a club good? How do they define it, and how do they work?
Well, so the economist to come up with the phrase club good and to formalize the notion was James Buchanan. He wrote a paper on the theory of club goods. I think it was in Economica, which is the economic journal of the London School of Economics. And his model has been modified by people in the public choice literature and in the public economics literature. But his model was something like, imagine a situation in which a good is actually excludable, but is non-rivalrous for like a certain extent of the long-run average cost curve. So basically, imagine like access to a big pool. So you can exclude access to a big pool, which means that you can have people pay a toll in order to come in, which means that you can price out people that do not value the good, at least as much as the necessary cost that is needed, the necessary contribution that is needed to keep the pool operating. So it's excludable, and it's non-rivalrous until, say, 100 people start getting into the pool at the same moment. So until the number 100, the marginal increasing cost for the individual member is negligible, which means that you actually want to increase the size of the club up until 100, because this way you can spread out the cost of operation. But after 100, the good becomes actually rivalrous, and so you want to create a limit of the number of people that can actually join the club at the same moment. which is what differentiates these from a public good. At least that was in Buchanan's vision. At the time, it's actually interesting. This is like an interesting history of economic thought thing. At the time, it wasn't really clear that a public good was characterized by the non-excludability condition. And the non-excludability condition was seen more as a technological or legal issue, but it was the non-rivalry aspect that was the public nature of the good came from the non-rivalry aspect. So that's the difference between a club good and a public good. And so the club good, you can have people pay for it because you can actually exclude people from joining the club. So this is Buchanan's vision. Other people have modified these by assuming, for example, that there is no crowding effect, that actually you want more and more people to join, and that makes the production of the club good better and better. I hope that was a clear exposition of the theory.
Yeah. So with the club good, usually if you did not limit access in any way to it, then people would use it until the marginal value of using it was zero.
Yes.
And so by restricting access on the margin, you'd operate beyond the point where you want more people in your club and then you want to exclude people. There are various different ways of doing that. Usually there's, sometime in the example of a swimming pool, put a fence around it and sell access or something, give membership to your friends and limit how many memberships exist. But with something more nebulous like a religion, or in this case, membership in a biker gang, in order to limit access, you often have rituals, costly sort of behaviors, hazing, things that make it costly to enter this club.
Exactly. And that's actually, one of the major insights in Iannaconi's paper is that indeed to have them pay at all to join the sect might actually be counterproductive, because in a lot of cases, willingness to pay is actually not correlated with the ability or willingness of the, say, prospective member to contribute to the production of the club good. So, for example, he has one of the examples that he has in his paper is the enjoyment from having other people sing religious songs. And let's assume that it's personally costly for you to sing along, maybe because you're really bad at singing and you're shy, but you enjoy that your fellow sect members are singing religious songs, but you need to make it so that he actually contributes. So, but that might not necessarily be correlated with his willingness to pay to be a member of the choir, let's say. So you need these basically costly discriminating signals and also the stigma to make it more likely that the marginal member is going to be one that is more likely to contribute a lot to the production of the club good. So let me put this in the perspective of the motorcycle gang. So there is a set of goods that people from this social milieu, the saloon society or the saloon milieu, needed access to, but they couldn't get in a private market because private markets don't usually sell these goods, and especially not at the margin of society. As I said, these people came from a very peculiar social background, and a lot of these people were unemployed or unemployable. They couldn't find a job. They were not able to keep personal relationships with mainstream individuals or like people from mainstream society, which is the phrase that they use. And so they need protection in this world. This is a very violent world. As I say in the paper, everyone wears a weapon. The likelihood that you're going to be part of a brawl is very high. The likelihood that you're going to be cheated on if you try, for example, to entertain a exchange with someone else, say you want to buy drugs or you want to buy the services of a prostitute or so on and so forth, is very high. So you need protection. You also need a place to stay in a lot of cases. You also might need a form of social insurance. And there's also the motorcycling aspect. You might enjoy going on runs. And you have to remember that at the time, it was actually very dangerous to ride by yourself. And in fact, people were discouraged from doing so because I have numbers. I think in my paper, I have some numbers on this. It was extremely likely to end up in an accident. It was way more likely for a motorcyclist to end up in an accident than for a car owner. And the responsibility was usually to get injured in an accident, of course. And the responsibility was usually that of the car owner, because people were not used to drive with bikes around. And so they weren't used to pay attention to whether there was a bike surpassing you, for example, or someone riding a bike on the right end of the street. And that's actually a recurring theme in the literature, especially on autobiographies by these motorcycle gang members. So you need access to all of these goods. And as per religious sects, it's very unlikely that willingness to pay, especially ability to pay in a situation like this, is going to be highly correlated with your ability to contribute to the club good. So they need to adopt some other form of screening device. The toll is just not going to be within the possibility set of these organizations. So what they do is that they introduce all those institutions that you were just referring to. And in the paper, I refer to two sacrifice practices. And one of them is called the road to the patch. So in order to have access to all of these club goods, you needed to be a fully patched member of the club. And this process could take a very long time. And in fact, on average, it took a couple of years. And it required going through 3 to 4 stages. And during this period of time, you had to be committed, especially for the period that is called the striking period, which lasted between 3 months and 2 years. You needed to be fully committed to the club. You needed to be at the disposal of fully patched members 24/7. You couldn't have a real job. You couldn't have personal relationships. You were actually encouraged to cut ties with everyone from the outside world. You lived at the clubhouse and you couldn't work. You couldn't make a living. So that's an extremely high cost in order to just join an organization that gives you the ability to basically hang around on a motorcycle on weekends. So that's why I think that the motorcycle aspect is overstated in a lot of works on motorcycle gangs. And again, at this period of time, I'm talking the years between 1947 and the 1970s, their involvement in criminal activities was actually negligible. So it's not even really access to jobs, for example, in the criminal world. The other institution was the other practice, sacrifice practice, was that you had to buy a motorcycle. And this might seem like a not very costly action to take, but they made sure that the act was actually very costly because they required that you buy a American motorcycle, which they refer to as American Iron. And it actually had to do a very specific kind of American motorcycle. And most clubs of this kind required that you have a Harley Davidson. And not just any kind of Harley Davidson, a Harley Davidson, an old, in most cases used Harley Davidson that was known for being an unreliable, expensive motorcycle. And you couldn't join the club if you owned a Japanese motorcycle. And Japanese motorcycles were known for being extremely reliable and cheap. And so while in the sociological literature, they argue that this rejection of Japanese motorcycles came from the fact that these were veterans who had fought against the Japanese during World War II. I argue that that might not be required as an assumption to explain these, but it might just be that you want them to have a motorcycle that requires them, for example, to make a very specific investment in skills that are required to fix the motorcycle. So that the practice of chopping, for example, emerges in this year. So basically, chopping is when you destroy your own bike, you take all the parts off and you build it back from scratch and you personalize it. And you personalize it so much that other people are basically unable to ride it. And which is interesting because it drives the market value of the bike to basically zero, which serves the economic logic of making the investment irreversible. You cannot now sell the bike and basically get your money back. And therefore, it is a very credible signal that you are willing to stay in the club when you buy a motorcycle and you modify a motorcycle like this. But these groups also had, like religious sects had stigma attached to them. And I explain some other practices of these clubs using this notion from the Iannacone paper. So, for example, and this is another interesting aspect of these groups, they had a very strong attachment to Nazi propaganda and Nazi symbolism and Nazi ideology. And for decades, they made very public this attachment by, for example, wearing patches that resembled the symbols from the Nazi regime, or they would have tattoos of swastikas and of white power on their faces. And they would refer to subgroups within their own organizations as, for example, the SS, or all sorts of references to Nazism. And once again, the people in the literature try to explain this with a reference to a sort of the result of alienation towards American bourgeois society. And what is better after World War II to express your rejection of the bourgeois ideology of the United States as basically endorsing Nazism, publicly endorsing Nazism. They also endorsed other practices and ideologies that were very much against the mainstream of 1950s United States. For example, Satanism was another big theme. But here's the problem with that explanation is that, first of all, it contradicts their own explanation of why they rejected Japanese bikes, because these are the same veterans that fought against Nazi Germany during World War II. And also, all of these authors in the literature refer to their desire for radical freedom and for a return to the American ideal of liberty, and how the motorcycle is the symbol of liberty and freedom and a rejection of authority. And then it seems odd that you would choose the symbolism associated with one of the most totalitarian regimes, or arguably the most totalitarian regime in the history of mankind. And my argument is that the sacrifice and stigma framework explains this. And it has nothing to do with alienation. It has to do with increasing the cost of members of interacting with people that are outside of your social milieu. Imagine what your reaction would be if you were at a restaurant and a group of people dressed in Nazi paraphernalia and like Nazi tattoos and with Nazi symbols all over their clothes. Well, you would be impressed in a very negative way, and it's unlikely that you would have to interact with them. And so this is a way in which they increase the cost of their members of interacting with outsiders, the same way that religious sects and extremist religious groups do with their members. And their image is referred to as the piratical look of motorcycle gang members. And that also plays into this because they didn't shave, they didn't shower for weeks. They purposefully wore very odd clothes. Like, for example, they dress in all leather in the summer in California, which must be very uncomfortable. but also creates an image that is an image of someone who doesn't belong to mainstream society and doesn't really appeal to members of groups other than your own. And so this is basically the logic. Go ahead.
Yeah, just if you're part of this group, I'm starting to see the logic of where all this Nazi paraphernalia, not showering, things like that are. If you have, you're part of a group and you want to know if the other members of the group are going to be loyal to you, if they're going to stick around, if suppose there's some kind of really bad situation where members of the group have to do something very costly, like for instance, if there was violence, then you might be worried that other people are not going to be as loyal as they say they are, and maybe they'll, as soon as things get tough, they'll leave the group and rejoin mainstream society and get a 9-to-5 job. But having a visible Nazi tattoo on your face or somewhere where they can't hide it in a job interview, that's a really strong, that's pre-commitment to not rejoin mainstream society. And by extension, it's a pre-commitment to remain loyal to the Hells Angels or whatever motorcycle gang you're a part of. That's what you're saying? That's the primary purpose of all of this?
Yeah, so again, you need two mechanisms. You need a mechanism that excludes people who are not very committed from the beginning, and that's a sacrifice. And knowing that, for example, you're not going to be able to get out of the group is a pretty high cost to pay, right? So if you're not very committed, you're not going to start to the process to become a member. The other mechanism that you need is the mechanism of increasing, once you are a member, increasing the opportunity cost of basically allocating your time and your resources to producing goods outside of the club. And by indirectly cutting ties with the outside world, that basically makes you more likely to invest within the club. And also, like, they have to make investment in human capital that they are unlikely to be able to use anywhere other than within a outlaw motorcycle gang. There is not much demand for people whose abilities are in fields like chopping a motorcycle or riding in a very wild manner, or being able to, one of the very important values that they have is that you have to be able to party in very extreme ways. So you have to be able to drink a lot of alcohol, and they put a lot of effort. Like, I make it sound like it is a job, because it is a job. They have to put a lot of effort into developing these abilities that are not productive in the market or from the point of view of mainstream society. And in fact, they're incompatible with a life outside of the group. You cannot party the way that they do, or like have the kind of practices that they do, or have the dress code that they require, and then go on to work in an office, as you said, a 9-to-5 job, and then when you're done, you just go back to the clubhouse and you hang out with your friends. That is just incompatible. And in fact, if you look at the literature, as I said, the Eli Berman paper on Orthodox Jews in Israel, it's extremely similar. They are required, for example, to study the Bible until they're 40. And that's all. They cannot work until they're 40 because they want you to be unable to provide for yourself and to be very productive in the mainstream economy, so that you have to rely on the group, and therefore you're going to be more likely to abide by the rules of the organization. It's kind of like a efficiency wage argument in a way. But instead of increasing your wage, I reduce your wage outside of the firm.
Right, your reservation wage is reduced.
Yes, I can think of one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can think of one additional example of something like this, which is Cortez, the conquistador, burning his ships when he landed in the New World, so that he could not, his soldiers could not retreat. They couldn't run it. Well, they could retreat. They couldn't rout. They couldn't run away. because they had nowhere to go. And
Correct.
so
It's
by destroying the outside option of getting on a ship and sailing away, you create a credible commitment to stand and fight, or stand and do whatever it is your organization does.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly you're like figuratively burning bridges with respect of the rest of society. And they were encouraged. For example, they encouraged them to cut ties with girlfriends who didn't belong to the same social environment for the very same reason. And families and friends and all these sort of relationships had to be abandoned. And again, that makes it very hard to come back. So it's a credible commitment. It increases the likelihood that the person is going to be a productive member of the club.
So let's talk about where these clubs' income comes from, because, of course, if you require your members to destroy any possibility that they could get a regular job and earn regular income in the above ground marketplace, where is the income coming from? And you also mentioned that before the 1970s, the organizations were not usually criminal. You know, where did their income come from before they entered crime en masse, and where does it come from now? Where did it come from now that they are pretty exclusively criminal organizations?
That's a great question. We know very little about this. We know that some people worked as mechanics. We know that individuals themselves were involved in criminal enterprises, but the organization was not. So the FBI, for example, has some files on investigations that they did on the Hells Angels since the 1950s and in the 1960s, and they find that the organization themselves have not much to do with crime at all. They were more worried about the fact that they actually suspected that they were connected to the Soviet Union, which motorcycle gang members would have found pretty funny because they see themselves as extremely patriotic. But individual members were involved in criminal activity. Mostly, they either worked for other criminal organizations. So, for example, in New York, the Hells Angels, members of the Hells Angels worked for the Italian mafia. Or they stole bikes, they stole cars, they maybe sold a little drugs, but that was the individual's prerogative. And they had to pay a fee to the club, a monthly fee to the club. And that was most, like, from what we know, that's most of where their income came from. But again, we have very, very little information about this.
Right. So I assume that a lot of the hazing and a lot of the aspects that make someone really, really unappealing to the rest of society would have got stronger and would have become more prominent after the organizations, we're talking about motorcycle gangs in general, became more involved in organized crime. It is really interesting that there's a connection to the Italian mafia there, because right now groups like the Hells Angels are in competition with the mafia, or at least doing similar things to them. So it's interesting that they started out working for or with other organized crime groups. So tell me about their organized crime operations. How do those work? How have they worked since the 70s, 80s when this all started happening?
Sure. So in the 1960s, especially the Hells Angels in California started to get increasingly involved in crime. And by the 1970s, they had adopted a new organizational form under the leadership of their long-time president, Sonny Barger, who is a very interesting figure. His autobiography is pretty entertaining. But they were mostly involved in the production and sale of drugs. specifically methamphetamine was the drug that they specialized on, especially in the West Coast. But they were involved in all sorts of drugs-related operations, and also the governance of the market for prostitution. They were very big players in that market. And they were also involved in other criminal enterprises, but those are the main ones. And so they start, as I said, in the 1960s, 1970s, and they grow more and more involved in the criminal world in the following decades. And in the 2000s, the Economists, I think in 1998, the Economists had a piece on motorcycle gangs, and they claimed that the global revenues to these criminal enterprises were in the billions of dollars. Of course, these do not go entirely to the head of the organization, and they're distributed at the local level. We can talk about the specific organizational structure, but clearly this is like the movement away from basically club-like organizations to criminal enterprises is correlated with the rise of the market for drugs in the United States, which took place in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And I argue that basically these people who had strong organizations within the specific milieu within which drugs became a very important source of revenues and also a very important part of people's lives were best positioned to take advantage of it. And this is what happens in the United States. This is what happens in Australia. This is what happens in Canada and in Europe later on. And especially this is interesting. I don't talk about this in the paper because it's really hard to confirm this hypothesis. But I think that if you look at the map of the United States and even internationally of where these organizations became strong players in the criminal underworld is exactly where you don't have a strong presence of ethnic mafias. So, for example, the Hells Angels existed in New York, but in New York, they didn't compete with the mafia. In Chicago, they didn't compete with the mafia. Now, in the rest of the Midwest, they basically had a quasi-monopolistic control of the territory. In rural California, they had a quasi-monopolistic control of the territory. In the Southeast, the same thing happened. And so they didn't really compete with these organizations. They were actually part of the same international network. And today, motorcycle gangs are part of, especially the Hells Angels, are part of this international network that includes drug cartels in Latin America, the Italian mafia, the Russian mafia, street gangs, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the way that they're now out of the production of drugs per se, they kind of specialized in the governance of the market for drugs rather than in the production of drugs. And so the drug cartels in Latin America take care of the production, and especially in the United States and in Europe, they take care of the distribution. This is different in Australia because Australia is so far away, so that the Hells Angels actually produce a lot of the drugs that they actually sell. And they've been in like big troubles for this. So this is the kind of
pattern. The pattern with all of these organizations is that they fill the gap that the state would usually fill, but has for one reason or another opted out of. So normally, the state enforces contracts. It runs courts and it has police, and if somebody cheats you take them to court and go through tort law, and then there's enforcement from the state. But if your drug dealer cheats you or your drug supplier, obviously that's not an option once these drugs have been made illegal and the state is cracking down on them. And so an organization like the Italian Mafia or the Hells Angels can step in, they can enforce disputes, they can regulate the market in many ways they're like a little state operating just in the areas where traditional states, the government of the United States of America, for instance, have ceded their authority.
Exactly. And my work comes out of the similar work on exactly the themes that you were just mentioning from Pete Leeson and David Scarbeck. David Scarbeck was my professor at King's College, and he kind of inspired my research on motorcycle gangs. And then Pete Leeson is a professor here at George Mason, and he encouraged me in my work on motorcycle gangs. But I think that motorcycle gangs are more like firms than they are enforcers of property rights and contracts in the market. So prison gangs are very much like a state or a governance institutions within a world where contracts are just not enforced by the state. I think that motorcycle gangs are slightly different in that they don't actually enforce property rights of people outside of their own membership. So today, these organizations are actually part of a extended criminal network that includes Latin American drug cartels, ethnic mafias, and street gangs as well. So they don't really compete with these organizations, but rather they're part of the same network. And if you look at what outlaw motorcycle gangs specialize in today, is mostly the distribution of drugs rather than the production of drugs. And the production of drugs is basically the drugs. These drugs are purchased from Latin American drug cartels. There's one exception, the Australian Hells Angels, because they're very far, and the cost of importing drugs, and especially due to the pretty effective border controls in Australia, they produce their drugs that they sell in Australia, and they do it themselves. But these organizations differ from other criminal organizations in that they don't really, like the mafia or prison gangs, specialize in the enforcement of property rights between two other parties. So they don't act as a third-party enforcer, but they act more as a firm that is specialized in enforcing a cartel or a collusive agreement between local motorcycle gang groups. So the Hells Angels were the first one to introduce this organizational structure, and they did so in the 1970s. And what happens is that you have the emergence of one of the what they call local chapters as the head of the organization. So you have the movement from an organization of loosely connected groups that had the same name, the same symbol, broadly the same rules for membership, but no one was really enforcing all of this. But in the 1970s, you have the Oakland chapter in California, again, emerging as the leader within the organization. And they introduced this new organizational structure where you have a separation of basically ownership and control. So the local chapters, so the chapters at the local level, can do basically whatever they want. They can operate in whatever markets they want. They can decide how to use their own resources. And that makes a lot of sense because they have the local knowledge of what is the best thing to do at the specific point in time in that specific place. So, for example, a local chapter of the Hells Angels in South Carolina might have different profit opportunities than a local chapter in Southern California or a local chapter in the Dutch Republic in Europe. So what the leadership of the organization, which is usually referred to as the mother chapter, what they do is that they give these local groups a residual clemency over the proceedings of their illicit activities. and the control over the use of their own resources. So, for example, what to do with their clubhouse, what to do with their weapons, what to do with their own labor and time and human capital. But the mother chapter keeps control and has residual clemency over the brand. And in my paper, I argued that this is a incentive compatible institutional structure. So it's a efficient contract in a way from a mechanism design point of view, such that the incentives of all the members in the organization are aligned. So let me explain a little better. The problem that you need to solve whenever you have an organization of this sort is that you have to have the enforcer being incentivized to actually enforce the collusive agreement, and the people at the local level have the incentive to actually contribute to the basically supporting the cost of the organization. And so how this is done is by giving the head of the organization, so the mother chapter in this case, or the Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels, ownership, economic control over the brand. And the head of the organization has the right and the ability to exclude non-members from using the brand, and also to exclude members from using the brand whenever the members violate the rules or directions of the leadership. But at the same time, you give the people at the local level the incentive to maximize the profit opportunities from the use of the resources at the local level. And at the same time, you give them access to this network, this international criminal network, due to the fact that they're members of the organization. So the organization provides them with access to, for example, information. This is a very important factor. The Hells Angels are known by law enforcement agencies to be very good at collecting information about investigations against the Hells Angels. And what they do is that they infiltrate law enforcement agencies, and they then circulate this information within their membership. And now this might be very, very important for members. For example, if you have a federal investigation, the investigation might take place in Washington, D.C., but it might pertain members that operate in Washington State. And now the motorcycle gangs members in DC can collect information, they can circulate it, and they can transmit it to the ones operating in Washington State. And so this is one of the goods that are provided by the organization, and the organization has an incentive to do so because they get paid a share of the criminal proceedings. And so they want to make the organization, the members at the local level, as productive as possible, given the resources that they have. So I argue that this is a very clever way to organize your criminal firm, especially given that you're a firm that operates internationally, and that there is no way that the head of the organization has the incentive or the information to dictate what everyone within the club must do at every point in time. And it works very much like a franchise in this way. But unlike a franchise, the enforcement of the contract is done through violent means rather than appealing to courts or the use of the state's ability to enforce contracts.
Right. That's very interesting. So the Hells Angels works a lot like McDonald's or other franchise firms.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what you mentioned about the local levels being residual claimants to their criminal earnings. So the local group does have to pay money to Oakland or to the the leadership of the organization. But if they were particularly good at earning money and they earned extra money above the amount they have to pay, they keep that for themselves. That's what a residual claimant is. It's the person who gets to keep the extra money that's left over at the end of a business enterprise, yes, or criminal enterprise in this case.
Yes, and in exchange, what they get is the enforcement of these cartel. It's a territorial. They have a territorial exclusivity clause in a say. This is not like a legal contract, right? But from an economic point of view, it's exactly the same. If I am a McDonald's a McDonald's store or a McDonald's restaurant, and I operate in a specific neighborhood or in a specific road or street in, say, Santa Monica, I'm only willing to sign the contract if McDonald's, the firm, the company, tells me that they're not gonna have someone else opening a McDonald's 50 feet from me. Right? They introduce a territorial exclusivity clause so that I actually get monopoly rents, and then part of these monopoly rents go to the national office or the head of the company. And the Hells Angels work exactly the same, but they can actually exclude other competitors as well. They can use violence, for example, to exclude other motorcycle gangs from operating within their territory, or other kinds of gangs. And there was a famous case in Canada in the 1990s. This is referred to as the Great Biker War, when the Hells Angels basically took control of Montreal, and especially the area, the suburbs of Montreal, and they excluded a street gang that already existed. I think they're called the Rock Machine, or they were called the Rock Machine. And they were able to exclude the Rock Machine after a war that lasted many years. And I think 60 people died during the 1990s. And the response of the street gang was to pledge allegiance to the outlaw motorcycle gangs, which is it's actually now the largest motorcycle gang in the world. They're larger than the Hells Angels. They're not as famous. And they joined the outlaws, and that war became one between the outlaws and the Hells Angels. And the Hells Angels actually won. And similar wars for the control of territory, monopolistic control of the territory, happened in Scandinavia. They happen in Germany. They happen in California. Southern California, the Hells Angels lost control of Southern California. That is now basically controlled by the Mongols Motorcycle Club, which is mostly a Latino motorcycle club. Is one of the few exceptions to the white-only membership within the world of motorcycle clubs. Yes, but that's exactly right. It works as a franchise, and the only difference is that they have the ability to use violent means, and they do. And that makes the role of the national office or of the leadership even more important, because now one of the functions of the central office is that of leading and reallocating resources during a period of conflict. Thus, for example, solving another free rider problem, because if I am, again, a Hells Angels local chapter in South Carolina, I might not have any interest in contributing to the efforts of fighting the outlaws in Canada, but the central leadership basically has control over all resources, including men, during when biker wars are declared, and so they can actually reallocate men from South Carolina to Canada for the duration of the war. It's a very clever, very interesting organizational structure, and the way in which the incentives are perfectly aligned, well, not perfectly aligned, of course, like nothing is perfect in the world, but are effectively aligned, is quite surprising for an organization of poorly educated people that are assumed to have behavioral issues. And as I have a quote in my paper, one police officer said that you're not going to be able to understand anything they do unless you assume that they're just psychologically unstable. And this is pretty clever for psychologically unstable agents.
Yes, it does seem like human beings have a tendency to create very efficient institutions, whatever situation we're in, and I think a lot of what economists like you, and you mentioned Scarbeck and other people in your paper, you also cite Pete Leeson, a previous guest of this show, and his work on pirates, who, of course, we might also think were outcasts from society, and we might not expect them to have complex and well-functioning institutions, but wherever we look, we tend to find them.
Yeah, and David Friedman as well.
Sorry. Actually, you know what? Go on. Before we close off, David Friedman.
I was just gonna say that you had David Friedman. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago on the show, and the lesson is the same. And I think it goes back to Hayek and his insight that society as a whole might be way smarter than every individual that composes it.
And on that note, my guest today has been Ennio Piano. Ennio, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me on the show.
I'm unveiling a new feature of this podcast, which will be a weekly discussion question based on the episode. So I'm going to say the discussion question, and then if you want to answer it, if you want to join a conversation related to the episode, specifically related to the discussion question for the week, you can join the Facebook group. That's Economics Detective on Facebook. So the discussion question for this week, we mentioned that the Hells Angels operates a lot like a franchise. What's the important difference between a Hells Angels franchise and, say, a McDonald's franchise? We know that they have differences in enforcement. The Hells Angels use violence. McDonald's uses the courts if they need to settle a dispute with one of their franchisees. What is the important economic difference that arises from that? How do these organizations differ other than this method of violence and other than the particular goods or services that they supply? If you want to answer that question, go to Economics Detective on Facebook and join the group.